And thank you all for coming, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
Good job, Dad.
Thank you, sweetheart. Why don't you guys go on ahead? I'll catch up in a little bit, all right? Can I help you?
Actually, my name's Josh. I contacted you a while ago. I'm with World War magazine.
Bill.
Great. I've been following your work, and I'd like to do a piece on you. It's basically your life story.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, we're an online international magazine, and so this could be the way you're remembered for thousands of years.
1,000 years.
Yeah.
Well, I'm flattered, and you know what? I have a little bit of time. You know, I grew up right around here.
Oh.
Yeah, and you know, I've spent my life fighting for education for the poor. You know, I started out as a teacher. And, you know, as you heard earlier, geez, I've been a screenwriter for 20 years, director for the past 10, have a beautiful family. And I guess you could say that I've just tried to lead a purposeful life.
Yeah, that's fine, but that's not the way we want the world to see you. See, we're going to spin you as child molester.
What?
Maybe pimp, male prostitute, jury's still out.
Oh, you're kidding. You're kidding, right? Are you? You better be, because I've dedicated my whole life.
Hey, wait, whoa, we got this covered. See, in the end, you will be redeemed.
What the hell does it matter if I'm redeemed later? I'm not any of those things now. They're not true. In fact, they're the polar opposite of how I've lived my life.
Wait. Like, I was just kidding, all right? Really, seriously, I'm just kidding.
Why? It's not funny.
To make a point.
What point?
See, one of the most misrepresented figures in Hollywood, or in history for that matter, is Mary Magdalene. And that's pissed some of us off. You know, nowhere in the Bible does it say that she was a prostitute. In fact, that was the polar opposite of who she was.
Oh, so that's what this is about. The portrayal of Mary Magdalene in my last screenplay. She lived ages ago. It's not the same thing. Look, sex sells. And besides, it makes for a great read. It makes for a good story.
Oh, okay, so you wouldn't mind if you went down in history as a child?
It would bother me. I already told you that. My God. You know, I don't understand. How did this fake story of Mary Magdalene being a prostitute get started in the first place?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus' most evolved, respected, and faithful disciples. Jesus himself gave her a position of leadership. She later met all qualifications required to be deemed an apostle, which were to have been one of his followers, and then to have witnessed a resurrection appearance with a call to spread his word. But to allow a woman to keep the title of apostle would have opened the door to giving other women more value and rights, which could have included giving them the right to lead or even preach in church. Mary Magdalene was demoted from being a highly respected apostle to a prostitute, becoming one of the most misrepresented people in history. In drawing, statues, and paintings, Mary Magdalene, the teacher and leader, is instead depicted as Mary Magdalene, the woeful, repentant whore. usually partially clothed, looking degraded. Oh, and often with at least one of her nipples hanging out just to drive the point home. Nearly 500 years ago, theologians and scholars discovered and complained that there had been an accidental or intentional compositing of Mary Magdalene with other women named Mary in the Bible, who clearly weren't her. And then in 1969, the church quietly, but officially, admitted its error. That was about, 50 years ago? Still nothing has changed. Hollywood has been the worst at keeping this disinformation going by continuing to cast Mary Magdalene as a prostitute in their films, though we know better.
Sir, actually, nowhere in the Bible does it say Mary Magdalene was a prostitute.
What? What did you say? I didn't hear you. La-di-da.
I said she was never a...
What? I can't hear you. Blah, 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 blah.
I said...
Can't hear you. Okay, where were we? Oh, now, have her wipe his feet with her hair. Oh, and don't forget to have her nipple fall out.
Hi, I'm your host, Casey Baker. Why does it still matter so much that Mary Magdalene's reputation was degraded? Taking the voice of a woman who was in such a powerful position of leadership in one of the world's major religions has had a huge impact on women and their place in this world for nearly 2,000 years. And we're talking women from all walks of life, from all walks of faith. In order to heal this, we need to go back to the beginning and rectify any misconceptions. Today we have with us Dr. Kayleen Asbo and Professor Anne Graham Brock, both of whom have studied Mary Magdalene and the New Testament extensively for years. Anne Graham Brock made Mary the subject of her Harvard dissertation, which was then later published into a fantastic book, Mary Magdalene, the First Apostle, The Struggle for Authority. Hi, Anne. Welcome. So, how did Mary Magdalene come to be the subject of your study?
My whole involvement and story about researching Mary Magdalene began when my husband and I decided to take an archaeology of the Holy Land class, and it was so good and so inspiring that we said, let's go to seminary. And so that's when I ran into a stumbling block, because my church happened to be conservative, and they said they wanted my husband to be a pastor for them, who had just joined us when we got married, and they didn't want me, and my grades had even been better than his. And so that was a tough hurdle for me, and so it became a burning issue for me at seminary when we joined an open and affirming seminary that ordained women and welcomed them. I wanted to know how it is that all of us as Christians can be reading the exact same New Testament, and yet some of us ordain women and some of us don't. And that's when Mary Magdalene became very important to me, because she's one of the keys to this whole question.
Kayleen, we always hear about the 12. What was Mary's place amongst Jesus' disciples?
We know from the New Testament that Mary Magdalene was a woman who enabled Jesus' ministry, financing it from her own means. We also know that she was the most loyal disciple present for the crucifixion until his last breath, and the first to go to the tomb to anoint his body. Outside of the New Testament, there have been other discoveries of early Christian documents in which Mary Magdalene holds an even more important place. She is described as the student at Jesus' feet who understood his teaching the best. She's actually called the woman who knows all, and the woman in whom wisdom is perfected more than all her brothers.
Upon first meeting, Jesus was said to have removed 7 demons from Mary. What could that actually mean in today's understanding?
What early Christians called demons, we would most likely today call mental distress. And that could be anywhere on a spectrum from depression to an anxiety disorder. And Jesus healed her of whatever it was that distressed her. There's another way to look at this passage, however, if you look through the lens of Eastern philosophy. In Eastern religious philosophy, there is a chakra system, and at the base of each chakra is this idea that there is a demon. And when the demons are expelled, it means that you are progressing on a pathway to enlightenment. So to have all 7 of these healed would mean that you were a fully enlightened individual.
It's interesting that even Jesus is accused of having demons as well, but it might have something to do with them having ecstatic experiences. It's not necessarily that there was something wrong with them, but that they might have had some sort of insights. But it's very rare that any reference is made to Mary Magdalene having demons. It's only in Luke and then copied in the long ending, later ending of Mark. With all of the books that I studied, and I started reading all the extra canonical books that were found, and text after text, nobody else spoke about Mary Magdalene having demons. So it's a rare reference, and it may be a critique to try to bring her down, but no one, interestingly, in dozens of books ever mentions it again.
What are the qualifiers that need to be present to be called an apostle? Did Mary qualify?
To be an apostle, you had to have been a follower of Jesus, and you had to have received a commission to go out and carry a message. Well, Mary Magdalene was actually the first apostle because she was given the commission by the resurrected Christ to go and proclaim the message of his resurrection.
When you ask most in the pews how many apostles were there, most of them will tell you 12, because that's what we've been inundated with and ingrained with, that there were 12 male apostles. And yet, an apostle is someone who gets sent out, as Jesus sent Mary Magdalene out to go tell the others the good news. She was the first resurrection witness, and then she gets sent in 3 of the 4 Gospels to go tell the others, either directly commissioned by Jesus or by angelic messengers, or in Matthew both, and she does, and she goes and tells the others. And so definitely she qualifies to be an apostle. Epistle is a letter that is sent. Apostle is someone who is sent on behalf of others. And that was a very important office. To be considered an apostle was a big deal and gave you a lot of religious authority. So that's why when you ask people, they say 12, but you go, well, how about Paul? Is he an apostle? Oh yeah, Paul's an apostle. He definitely deserves to be called an apostle, no question. We have to open that category up past 12. And then if you say, if Paul should be an apostle, and if James and others should be apostles, why not Mary? She was the first one to see him as a resurrection witness, and she was sent to go tell the others. So why can't you have ordination and religious authority for women when you have it modeled right there and commissioned by Jesus? So when I asked a conservative biblical scholar one day why you wouldn't give an apostolic office to women, he said, well, let me explain it this way. He said, Mary was like a secretary to the 12 male apostles, and then they had an executive mandate to go out to the whole world. And I told my class that and rolled my eyes. I said, so this is how you frame it then. And then one of my students said, well, if you're going to use an anachronistic model like that, then I think it ought to be that Mary was the CEO and those 12 guys are the branch managers. And I said, you have an A for the day. Oh, I loved it.
Not only was Mary granted a resurrection appearance, she was actually the first person that Jesus appeared to. I'm sure that had significance.
Mary Magdalene was the most loyal of all the disciples. She was there while he suffered on the cross to the bitter end, and she was the first one there to anoint his body. So it makes complete sense that the person who was the most dedicated to you in life would be the one that you would appear to give the message of greatest hope and liberation.
What was Mary's relationship with Peter like?
In the early church, there were enormous tensions between Peter and other disciples, between Peter and Paul, between Peter and James, and especially between Peter and Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel of Mary, Peter attacks Mary's telling of the message that Jesus gave her. And he said, "Did Jesus talk to a woman like this?" One of the other disciples, Levi, comes to her defense and he says, "Peter, you are always hot-tempered, and now you're attacking women like our adversaries do." It may be that Peter was jealous of Mary because she had such a close relationship with Jesus. It may be that he felt guilty because he denied Christ 3 times, while she was the faithful one who stayed present with him to the very end. Or it may be that their ideas about Jesus' central message were radically different. We know that Peter was an uneducated and illiterate fisherman. We have reason to believe that Mary Magdalene was a highly educated and affluent woman. They came from different worlds with different perspectives. Peter was very conservative. Mary Magdalene was very unusual and forward-thinking, perhaps, for her time. And so the conflicts between their interpretation of their teachers, as well as the gender conflicts between them, were enormous.
How and why did the degradation of Mary Magdalene begin? Could it have been intentional?
Okay, Mary Magdalene did very well in terms of becoming well known. She had a lot of followers, apparently, and we know that from other texts. I mean, at some point, she became known as the apostle to the apostles. And then all of a sudden, you check with most people today, and when I mentioned that I was doing a dissertation on Mary Magdalene, I wish I had $1 for every time I heard, "Oh yeah, the prostitute." Numerous things happened to her narrative, and some of them were purposeful, I think, to keep women's authority in check, and some of them may have been accidental, but the diminishment of Mary Magdalene's status really became officially clarified by Pope Gregory the First in 591. He did a sermon where he pulled together and coagulated all of the Marys, the Mary of Bethany who washed Jesus' feet, and then the woman in Luke who was unnamed, and she came in and they called her sinner of the city, and that's where the prostitute came from, but she was not Mary Magdalene. In the very next set of verses in chapter 8, Mary Magdalene is introduced as a new character. I even said in class, I debunk that she was not ever called a prostitute in the New Testament. And one of my students came back the next day and said, "I was just sure you were wrong, and I spent all evening looking for it, and it isn't there."
Do you believe that Mary and Jesus were married?
That is a very tricky question. There are many who would say, well, Jewish men were expected to be fruitful and multiply, and therefore it was incumbent upon Jewish males to be married. But you know, when you go back to the New Testament, you don't have to go very far to find that there were others in Jesus' family and in other men who weren't married. But what bothers me most about the sexualization of Mary is that they act like, well, in order for her to have been an important part of his circle, she must have been married to him. And when I read all of these fabulous texts where Mary is spoken about so highly and has such a terrific profile amongst all the disciples, Gospel of Philip says that Jesus loved her more than all the others. And that is part of why Dan Brown brought in to the fore, to the public, that they must have been married, that Jesus used to kiss her often, and then the text breaks off. They showed that ants had actually eaten into it. He used to kiss her often on the, and it has been supplied on the mouth, but it could have been on the cheek, could have been on the forehead. In early Christianity, we do know that that people greeted each other with kisses, and we have 6 references in the New Testament where Peter and Paul say, greet each other with a kiss of love, or greet each other with a holy kiss, Paul says. So we don't know that they didn't just greet each other, and making too much of this kissing, I think, is wrong. So I would like to see Mary Magdalene honored as a woman who really got it, and maybe that's why she was one of his favorite disciples. And if we find out later that they might have been married, I know Jesus came into this world to experience everything that humans were experiencing, and maybe he was married. But I don't like just jumping to conclusions because Mary Magdalene was a strong female leader.
There is nothing in the New Testament that either supports or contradicts the idea of a married Jesus. If we expand our gaze further and we look to the Nag Hammadi library, there is one book, the Gospel of Philip, in which Mary Magdalene is described as Jesus' koinonos. Koinonos is a word that Dan Brown and others have taken and translated to mean a sexual companion, either a lover or a wife. But it's also a word that could mean business partner or spiritual companion. For example, the Apostle Paul describes traveling with his koinonos, and Paul was celibate and emphatically not married. Ultimately, it's up to us to decide that question because nothing textually will give us a definitive answer.
When Jesus spoke of the Holy Spirit, what gender did he assign to him or her? And how did this affect what we have come to know as the Holy Trinity?
In the language that Jesus spoke and preached and taught in, Aramaic, the word for Holy Spirit is decisively feminine, as it is in Hebrew, wherein it is ruah. But when Jesus' words were written down in a later time, they were written down in Greek. And in Greek, Holy Spirit is neuter. In later centuries, the Greek New Testament was translated into Latin. In Latin, Holy Spirit is masculine. So what we grew up with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all being masculine, was not what Jesus preached and taught. What he said was Holy Father, Holy Mother, Spirit, and Divine Child. A family, not a trio of men only.
So am I then understanding this correctly, that there was a systematic removal of women in power and the feminine in the church, including the entire feminine aspect of God? Because then that would mean that we've had a completely distorted view of God and the world. I mean, that would have changed everything.
It's super important that we now have more women who are doctoral students and learning the ancient languages so that they can go back and re-examine the translations that we have been working with now in English in the original language and say, what did it really say? And not have a layer between us and them of what the male patriarchal translators of the past couple centuries have handed us. We need to go back and read it on our own, because then we get better insights into what women's voices and roles and traditions were.
From the 2nd century on, there was a systematic and very deliberate erasure of women from the Christian story. 2 of the most egregious examples of this are in Paul's letters, where he refers to a fellow disciple, a woman that is named Junia, who he regards very highly as an apostle. Well, several centuries later, Junia was changed into Junius, masculine, which persisted for centuries. We also have visual evidence for this, that there was another disciple named Thecla, whom Paul traveled and preached with. And in Ephesus, there is an image of the two of them side by side of equal stature, and both of them have their hands up in a blessing mudra of teaching and preaching and blessing. Well, Thekla's eyes have been gouged out, and her hand has been burned off. So what we see is Paul intact in his position as apostle, and the very deliberate defacement and erasure of Thekla in a like role. In the Vatican, there is a gorgeous painting in which the Virgin Mary is sitting enthroned with baby Jesus, and surrounding her are disciples. Well, to Jesus' right hand, someone has been cut out of the picture. There's a gaping hole. This is a profound symbol for what happened to Mary Magdalene and other important women in early Christianity. They were simply cut out of the story, sometimes transformed into something much less, or in Mary Magdalene's case, transformed from being the apostle to the apostles, to a penitent sinner, to an adulteress, to finally a prostitute. Cut out of the story and replaced with something that was completely fictionalized.
So now we know. Mary Magdalene was the polar opposite of the person she was suddenly changed and depicted to be throughout the centuries. She was a woman of honor and deep wisdom. She was a woman of means who helped fund Jesus' movement. She received special teachings from Jesus due to her profound understanding. Changing this information also dramatically changes an important part of Jesus' message, especially around women. Mary Magdalene was the most faithful disciple. It was she, the Gospels all agree, who stayed by Jesus' side to the very end, until his final breath, while the other disciples fled in fear. And she was the first person who the risen Christ chose to appear to. Jesus himself put her in a position of leadership as the one who understands completely. Mary Magdalene's rightful title was and is Apostle to the Apostles. Now, that is how she will be remembered once again.